In the States or abroad, no one's safe from the talkers of fraud. In the States or abroad, no one's safe from the talkers of fraud.
The following goes beyond the show and beyond the gram to bring you all the fraud that's fit to be uncovered. This is the Fraudcast, and now, here's your fraudcaster and the woman behind Frauded by TLC on Instagram, Katrina.
Hello and welcome to the Fraudcast. I am Katrina, Frauded by TLC.
And I am Hanekawa.
And welcome to 2020, you guys. Can you believe it's the new year, our first show of the new year?
Yay! First show of the new year. Everything's a first today.
Yeah, first day back to work for you.
Yes, it hurt.
How was that?
It's like I honestly went back. I was driving back and I'm like, I don't remember how to get to work. And I got to work. I'm like, I don't remember where I park. And then I went inside. I'm like, I left my laptop in my car.
Oh no! Do you remember what you do?
It was definitely a Monday. It was like a Monday of all Mondays. And everyone was making dad jokes about it being 2020 and people who wear glasses and oh my God. It was just hard. It was just hard.
The eye, 2020 eyes.
Yes. They're like, this is the year for like perfect vision. And I'm like, God. Looking back and noticing all your mistakes.
Oh, hindsight is 2020. See, that's the first I've heard of it referred to that way. All I've heard is like roaring 20s. Like everybody has been referring to it in that regard.
And a lot of the New Year's parties were themed roaring 20s out here. So everyone was in their, 20s, were the clapper girls kind of thing. But
Right. I was home, as were you, I believe. I was here hanging out on Instagram Live with all of you guys, all of the trash followers, the fraudsters, fraudcasters. I don't know. What do we call them? Fraud followers?
The fraudsters.
Fraudsters? I like that.
I think it's perfect.
Our team at the Fraudcast and our fraud consultants in the field.
They
give us information.
That's fantastic.
Just got some information today that confirms Annie is in the United States.
Really?
A fraud contributor from the field, yeah.
How'd they find that out?
She posted a screenshot from Instagram about she was having problems. I guess she'd gone back and forth with her account from private to public a lot. Mm-hmm. She was trying to go back private, and Instagram was like, okay, but all the people that are pending to be your followers, you're going to lose those. It's just so you know, we don't we restrict this after a while when you do it too much.
Oh.
So she posted a sad face screenshot.
Okay.
And you could tell in the top corner, it said, was it T-Mobile, boost T-Mobile, and it had the time on the.
And T-Mobile's only accessed for USA. That is not an international service.
And the time she posted it lined up with the East Coast time that was listed, that was on the screen grab. Oh. So we actually we had somebody who reached out to her and was like, that shows that you're still in the United States, XYZ. And she's like, oh no. And she pulled it
oops. Off. Oh my goodness.
So. But that came from a fraudcaster in the field, or a fraudster, or a fraud consultant. I'm not sure what she wants to be called. But anyway, let's get on with it.
Yes.
So we are the Fraudcast. For those of you guys just joining us in the new year, we have a Facebook group called the Fraudcasters. Welcome to join us there. I am Frauded by TLC on Instagram, and you are Cactus Fruit Juice on Instagram.
Well, we have to be careful. It's cactus_fruit_juice, because I found Cactus Fruit Juice, and they're really just about cactus.
Oh, imagine that.
Imagine it was a name that corresponds to what they actually are.
Oh, man.
So don't forget those underscores, or you're going to be following sweet succulents, which isn't bad, but I do follow that person now because I had to.
Do they follow you back? That's
no, they're probably just like, I'm not into that. Anyone who looks at my page is like, what are you? I don't know. I'm not a blogger. I'm nothing. But
that's not true. You were a co-host of the Fraudcast.
Yeah, mine's is the page. Mine's the page for the madness that is. I don't know.
My goal is to get one of my goals for the podcast this year is to get Chrissy Teigen to take notice of the podcast.
Oh my goodness. And she loves the show. I think she picked it up less than a year ago also.
Yeah, she's all in hardcore, right?
Oh my God, yes.
And I tag her and I message her and stuff all the time, but of course she's not going to see it on Instagram because I'm sure she doesn't manage her own DMs and stuff, and they're never get seen. They're never marked as seen. So
when you have that many followers, nothing goes to your inbox. You have to actually sit all day and search your other, and no celebrity has time to do that. So
Right. So I don't know how it's going to happen, but, it's the beginning of the year. It's a whole new year. We've got 12 months to make it happen. So let's make that happen.
That's going to be the Fraudcasts New Year's resolution.
Yes.
Will be like a senpai notice me type thing. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
I'll have to explain later, but basically.
What it reminded...
For all my weeb friends, basically, we need senpai to notice us.
Okay.
On some
it reminds me of back in the day when David Letterman was on the air. He always wanted to meet Oprah, and he had this thing every single night that was like this countdown or days without meeting Oprah, and then he finally got to meet her. So it was this huge thing, and it dates me. It shows you what my age is when I was watching David Letterman. But if any of you guys remember that, hit me up. Let me know. And in any case, so here we are. We have a really exciting show to start off the new year with a bang. We have a former visa officer, U.S. visa officer, on the show tonight, and he's going to talk to us about the process, the K-1 process, all of these things with the process, his thoughts about specific couples. Maybe why Michael was denied and why Annie was approved after they'd only met each other for 8 hours. And we also crowdsourced this on Instagram and Facebook, and you guys had some questions. So we are going to put those to him as well. And why don't we just get to it then? Hi, and welcome to the show, Agent C.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on with us.
It was my pleasure. I've been very excited to talk to you guys.
So tell me what your job was and what that meant, what your role and duties were. What's your background? What gives you any kind of authority to be here on the show with us rather than just some Joe Schmo I found on Reddit to, spew out of his ass?
Yeah, that's right. So I used to be a career foreign service officer at the U.S. State Department. And one of my jobs when I was working there was at a consular post in southern China. And the job I had when I was there was to be an immigrant visa officer. So as part of the job, I would adjudicate something like 30 cases a day. And it ranged from across all the different immigrant visa categories, spousal visas, conditional spousal visas, children, parents, brothers, sisters. We also had categories for investors, certain types of qualified employees, but also the K-1s. So I would.
When you say adjudicate, what do you mean by that?
What that means is you get a case in front of you, you got the person in front of you, and you have to make a decision. An adjudication is basically a decision.
Okay. So are you interviewing the person?
Yes.
Okay.
So the way it works is that every person who applies for a visa has to come to interview with you. You interview them, you ask some questions, and then you make a decision about whether you're going to approve the visa or not approve the visa. And in immigrant visas, it's a little bit different than like a tourist visa where you can just straight up deny and kick them out. You have, if you're going to decide you don't want to issue a visa or you think the underlying relationship is fraudulent, you have to take some special steps. But basically my job was to decide if the person who was in front of me at that time is going to get a visa or not get a visa. And so I would do about 30 a day. I did probably over the course of my time there, did several thousand of these adjudications, and several hundred K-1s were part of that. Usually I'd probably do maybe, between 2 and 5 a day.
Okay. So when you say you make the decision, is that like the whole visa process that takes years and their paperwork and it goes through all these different offices, it all stops with you and you're the ultimate decision maker?
That's correct. So an applicant for an immigrant visa or for a K-1 visa is going to have done a lot of different paperwork up to that point. They have to file what we call a petition with USCIS, that's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Once that's approved, then that goes through a bunch of other processing where they collect other data. That's all checked over to make sure it's complete. And then it's sent overseas to an embassy or consulate where it reaches my desk. And then I sit there at a window. You know, if you think about going to a government office or like getting your driver's license, you're at a counter with a person on the other side of the computer. That's what the visa process is like, except you have bulletproof glass between you and the applicants. So you're there interviewing them, and you have to decide, does everything in the packet and everything that they're telling you satisfy the conditions for issuing that particular class of visa?
So have you had, like, do you get the case file before the person comes in for the interview, so you've had a chance to review everything and then decide? Or how does that work? Because if you're the decision maker, you need to have all of that information.
Right. Typically, we get the case files that morning.
Oh, okay.
So it's very rare that you would ever get the case file before you actually sit down and interview the person. Typically, what happens is, especially at a high volume posting, is you sit down at your window. There's a stack of folders behind you, about 30 of them, and you just pull them one at a time, open them up, look at it, interview the person. Sometimes, especially when you're new, you'll open it up and you'll review the documents before you call the person up. But after you've done a bunch of them for a while, you can just call the person up and review the paperwork while they're standing there and ask them questions. So there's not a lot of advanced work done when you're reviewing the file.
So they spend years putting this paperwork together, and you review it for 10 minutes before you interview them?
Oh, not even 10 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds about right in government, though.
Yeah. It does, doesn't it? Yeah.
And I'm speaking because I'm in there too, so that makes a lot of sense.
It's even worse for what we call the non-immigrant categories, the people who are coming on tourist visas. They fill out this really long application. They pay a big fee. They come in and get fingerprinted, and they're at the window for maybe 30 seconds.
And it's a quick yes or no. You just glance through the paperwork and go, yes, it's a legit relationship. Like you glance through the pictures or whatever, the receipts of the hotels of their stays.
Yeah, if you're doing a relationship visa, typically you'll look at, well, for me, I would look at the pictures. I'd look at the supporting documentation, the financial stuff. I didn't really care about. They'd give you reams of chat logs and phone records, but you don't really know that from Adam, right? You could make something like that in Excel in a weekend. Mm-hmm. So I never really considered that to be much value. What you're looking for is, what can you glean from what they're saying about the person and what the pictures in front of you show. I liked pictures. Not everyone really relied on them. Sometimes they just rely on talking to the person, and you have to figure out really quickly, is this person trying to fraud me or not? What's going on with this person? What's their motivation? What's the petitioner's motivation? Do we have something approximating a real relationship by the definition of the law?
Okay, so it sounds like you have a lot of discretion within certain confines, right?
Uh-huh.
Can you explain that a little bit? Like how much discretion and sort of what your rubric barriers are? Like this is your world and you have discretion within that, or do you have very strict SOPs if you have this or this or this, or is it a lot of it is just a judgment call of that individual officer?
Well, it depends. A lot of it depends on the visa category. So if we're going to focus on relationship visas,
yeah, let's do that.
The way it's supposed to work is if you're doing, so I'm going to use a little bit of jargony terms, but bear with me. I'll explain it. If you're doing a spousal visa, and there are three categories of spousal visas for American citizens. There's the IR1, which is for a person who's been married 2 years or over 2 years. There's the CR1, which is for someone who's been married less than 2 years. The C stands for conditional. And then there's also the K1 for a fiance. And within those, the way it's supposed to work is that by the time it gets to you, USCIS has made a decision about the relationship. You have an approved petition in front of you, and USCIS has decided that their relationship meets the underlying legal criteria for someone to make that kind of an application. So the relationship has satisfied USCIS that the American citizen and the foreign, we call them a beneficiary, meets the requirements to be issued a visa for that purpose. And so what you're really doing, what you're supposed to be doing is checking for ineligibilities, because there's in the underlying legal statute, there's a whole list of all kinds of ineligibilities for people who are trying to immigrate to the U.S. They range from things like having certain types of diseases to certain types of criminal backgrounds to being a member of a totalitarian party. So since I was in China, that actually came up more often than you might think, because China's still controlled by a communist government. Things like, people who've overstayed their visa in the past, who have tried to smuggle other people over the border in the past, the whole big list of ineligibilities. You have to check for those. And then you're also checking to see if there's any new information that might materially impact the underlying decision that USCIS made. Now, the word material I'm picking very intentionally, because if you're practicing law, you know that materiality has a very specific, it sets a specific threshold for evidence, right?
Right,
if you're taking somebody to trial for a crime of some kind. So we use the term, we use the term material misrepresentation, meaning that a type of, basically someone's frauding you in like a big way. They faked their passport, they faked their marriage certificate, they faked their birth certificate, for example. This was especially bad if you were dealing with like people trying to smuggle children.
Oh, wow. Right. Okay.
Yeah, you have to check for fake birth certificates. And that could be a grounds for ineligibility. And so you're checking for things that USCIS didn't have access to do kind of a double check on their decision. But if you're not able to find material evidence that contradicts USCIS's decision, you're supposed to move ahead and try to adjudicate them. And so where discretion comes in is that while that's the way it's supposed to work, in effect, visa officers can hold a case up for virtually any reason if they think there's something fishy going on.
Okay. And is that oh, go ahead.
I have a question branching off that, because you're saying your authority right then and there with the interview is to say yes or no. Is there any case where something is pre-approved and the interview is just happening for formality? Does that ever happen?
That's a good question. Pre-approved, I'm not sure there's ever a case where something is pre-approved, but there's certain types of visas that they're not spousal visas where you're going to approve absent something wild happening. And that's for things like diplomatic visas, right? Okay. A country's government says we want diplomatic visas because we're sending these people to our embassy in Washington, D.C. The odds that you would refuse that for any reason are extraordinarily high.
Gotcha.
Extraordinarily rare. So it's not pre-approved, but it's almost certainly going to be approved, barring some crazy scenario. But beyond that, no, I think that the decision to approve or disapprove a visa really is made right at the time of the interview.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to recap, getting to that window there is the paperwork has made its way through USCIS.
USCIS, yeah.
USCIS. Okay.
Yeah.
And they have made an initial determination that the relationship. So let's focus on relationship visas here.
Sure.
They made an initial determination that the relationship meets a certain threshold.
Mm-hmm. And
then it goes to you for further analysis as to whether that is a legitimate relationship, because is that different standards? So it sort of like funnels its way down, or?
I think it's really more of an informal relationship. The official sort of routing is that USCIS makes a decision about the relationship. Then a bunch of paperwork is assembled and some perfunctory background checks are run. But because anyone who receives a visa is required by law to appear before a consular officer and be interviewed and have their ineligibilities determined, that provides an extra screening mechanism. And one of the things that they do as part of that extra screening mechanism is just to just double check USCIS's work. I don't think it's not prescribed by regulation or the law, but it's something that's done as a matter of practice. Because here's the applicant before you. It's like with, someone, let's use Michael and Angela as an example.
Perfect.
Right? Someone at USCIS got this paperwork, and he's got basically a checklist. And I'm not an expert on USCIS. I had friends who worked for USCIS while I was doing my visa job, so they told me a little bit about how the process works. So, if I get a slight detail wrong, I pray in advance for the mercy and forgiveness of your listeners. But basically, they have a set of criteria, right? A list of criteria that have to be met in order for them to approve. And they're going to look at the evidence in front of them and make a decision basically on paper whether this relationship as presented by this evidence meets the criteria. So they'll see pictures of Michael and Angela. They'll see that she's been to Nigeria twice in the last 2 years, because there's a requirement for K-1 visas that you've met once in the last 2 years. That's, by the way, how Robert could get away with meeting Annie once and still having her technically be approvable for a K-1. I know that question comes up a lot. How in the world could someone who's met someone for 8 hours
that is on the list of questions, yes.
Yes, check.
Yes. So they've got their checklist. They've got these pictures of Angela and Michael. They've got receipts. They've got evidence of their phone calls or whatever else they submitted. And if it checks all the boxes, then okay, they'll approve the petition and it moves on to the next step. But at that point, no one's gotten to talk to Angela or Michael. It's only when the paperwork has weaved its way through the system, gotten to the embassy in Lagos, and the visa officer has the file in front of him and Michael's standing right there, that they can really start to dig into the relationship in a way that a USCIS officer never could. And so, and especially in a place like Nigeria, which has a reputation for being a high fraud area, they're going to try to do some extra due diligence. And because he's right there, he can give information that USCIS never could have. And not just from what he says, it's from how he reacts.
Right. There's incredible value. As a lawyer who has spent 10 years interviewing witnesses in my office, there's an incredible value to interviewing them face to face to determine credibility and their mannerisms and things like that, and that you can't get talking to them on the phone or just looking at their paperwork file. So I completely understand that there's a even if it is through a window, you're still face to face and you can see sort of the I guess the genuineness of them. And
you're trained, you're given some basic training in how to read subtleties of body language.
Oh, fascinating.
That was going to be one of my questions, because that has to be a major indicator of truthfulness and how they dodge questions, maybe how long it takes them to answer, how long it takes them to formulate an answer.
Right. And they're little, and the really good people take years of training to get it. But when people are lying, there are certain things that their faces do. Sometimes they'll be saying no, but their head's nodding yes. Mm-hmm. And there are all these little tells that if you look very carefully, you might be able to pick up. And if you pick that up, then you're like, and it contradicts what your paperwork says. You might think, I might want to examine this a little bit more carefully.
Sets off your spidey senses.
Yeah, and because at the end of the day, the U.S. immigration law, and particularly the law that governs visa issuance, is there to prevent illegal immigration. Mm-hmm. So they're going to try to find fraud where they think it exists. And in a place like Nigeria, it's so renowned for fraud, it has a scam named after it.
Right. True.
Yeah.
Are there any other countries? Like, is there a list somewhere of like top fraud countries, or is that dynamic and always changing?
It's always changing depending on the socioeconomic circumstances of a particular place. Obviously, and not to be crude, but typically the worse off a country is, the more you have to kind of question the motives. I know that when I was working in China, the place where I was posted was considered the highest fraud part of China. Other postings, although they didn't handle immigrant visas, were, there are different regions that are seen as more high fraud than others. In a place like China, for example, you've got the rich coastal enclaves. You're not going to be worried about those areas because their standard of living is relatively better off than in the interior. But interior provinces, you got to really be careful for. And then there's one particular province that's known as Fraud Central.
Oh, wow. So, and the reason for that is because the worse the economic situation is, the more likely people are going to be trying to use any avenue they can to escape it.
That's correct.
That's the thinking.
Yeah, and people are, and certainly we can be sympathetic to that. People are always looking for a way to improve their situation, and some people make the decision that coming to the U.S. by any means necessary is the way to do that. And if you're living in that's why, for example, places like Japan or Western Europe, there's very little concern about fraud from those areas because they have a comparable standard of living to us. But where it's a bit tougher, or in a place like China where you have restricted freedoms, very high income inequality, people are going to feel like maybe they've seen the limit of what they can do there, and they're going to try to go somewhere else. Especially here in the U.S., we have a huge overseas Chinese population. Very easy for them to integrate.
Okay.
Yeah, but our job is to weed that out wherever we can. So I'm trying to get back to your question of what places are high fraud. It's always changing, with Nigeria always being at the top.
Is it the number one?
I think so. It has sort of a legendary status. I can't think of any place that's more well known for fraud than Nigeria. Although there's certainly other places. It by no means has the monopoly.
Makes sense.
So going back to that, sort of piggybacking off that question, is there, when a file from, say, Nigeria, say Angela and Michael's file comes to you, if you were in Nigeria, just, play along here. Is there a presumption do you operate off a presumption? Because, I'm a lawyer. Everything's about presumptions and burdens of proof, right? Is there a presumption that the relationship is valid and you're looking for ways to invalidate it? Or is the presumption, especially with a country like Nigeria, you're going to assume when the file hits your desk and Michael shows up in front of you that the relationship is a sham and you're going to poke holes in it and prove that? Like, what's that burden or presumption?
That presumption is dynamic. It depends a lot on the particular visa officer. Some of them are just more aggressive, but it also depends on the fraud profile of the country. A country that's seen as lower fraud, I don't think is going to have as much of a problem. But a country like Nigeria, the officers are probably going to be a little more skeptical. And especially when a file comes to your desk and it checks a lot of the common fraud patterns, then you're going to say, you're going to be like, oh, your antennas are going to go up, and you're going to say, I'm really going to give this one a hard look because I'm already seeing some big trouble signs. And which is, if this is premature, you can tell me, but that's really what I think happened to Michael.
Well, okay, let's break that up for a second. So talk generally this category of things that set off your antenna, yours or in general, or, just as sort of in the office, the position. Talk about things that will set off your antenna and set off those spidey senses. And then let's get back to Angela and Michael and the specifics of what you think might have happened there. Right.
So common fraud patterns, some of them are have cultural context, types of relationships that are out of place for the culture. But typical ones will be a significant gap in age, what we might call, I think I call on the last Reddit thread I did, I called it what I call the reverse age gap, which means you have a female participant in the relationship who's much older than the male participant. I've gotten questions about age gaps before. it's not uncommon for there to be relationships where you have a really old dude bringing over a really young lady, and sometimes the gaps can be very significant. But those relationships,
that doesn't set off a fraud.
Well,
this may be a little sexist, but that doesn't set off fraud because it's a dirty old man is normal versus a cougar woman.
Yeah, old men are creepers, man. You know, they can be dirty old men, and you know, those cases are actually pretty easy. You know exactly what they're going for. And for the female beneficiary, you know, they're getting usually there, and you know, this is terrible to say, they're usually from a poor, you know, let's take Michael and Juliana, for example.
That's where I was going to go with it.
I think that's going to keep us out of trouble. You know, Juliana is a young model from an interior part of Brazil. It's very poor. Michael is a rich, although, you know, people debate how rich he is. I don't know if you see that on Instagram, but certainly on Reddit, some people question if he actually has that much money.
Are you familiar with what we do here at the Fraudcast? we dig deep. Yeah. We dig deep into that stuff. Yes, we're aware.
Then is he as loaded as he appears?
He's got money, but he's not a millionaire, not like a billionaire 10 times over or anything like that. I mean, he's perfectly comfortable.
Okay, so but from Juliana's perspective, right? He's a wealthy American man, and you know, you can debate on kind of what they're in it for. I think Michael was probably pretty as upfront as anyone is on the show. But that relationship makes a lot of sense, right? It's like, okay, he's kind of might be a somewhat awkward but wealthy American guy, and here's a really attractive young Brazilian model who doesn't want to stay in the profession she's in or in the area of Brazil that she's in. It's, you know, if they have enough of a connection, it's a win-win situation for both of them. It may not be the Shakespearean definition of love, but it's logical. It makes sense, right? You know what they're in it for, and
so that wouldn't set off any red flags or fraud, even though it does seem very transactional. That seems to you a legit relationship.
Yeah, transactional isn't against the rules,
right?
Let me back that up. Let me back up on that. There's a certain type of transactional that's not against the rules. If Juliana wrote Michael a check and said, right, I'm going to give you $5,000, you're going to file this paperwork for me, and as soon as I get to the U.S., I'm going to disappear, and you're just going to show up when we have to do interviews, that is not allowed. But if it's transactional in the other way,
sort of colloquial,
yeah,
you know, kind of a dirty old man. He's not as much of a dirty old man as we initially thought, you know, and young, hot trophy wife. Like, there's a certain transaction. She's going to get something out of it. He's getting something out of it. It works out.
Exactly. And
it's interesting we see it that way, not to go off on a tangent, but with the reverse one, I'm thinking Angela and Michael versus Juliana and Michael. We look at Angela sympathetically going, she probably doesn't know better. He's scamming her. Mm-hmm. When we look at Michael and Juliana, we go, they're both getting something great out of it. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting double standard.
It's a little bit. Yeah, we do tend to think of these things differently. Although I will say in Michael and Juliana's defense, he is definitely by far not the dirtiest old man I've ever seen.
Not at all, I'm sure.
Oh no. He's of the lower order of creepiness. I would consider him even not creepy.
Yeah. Like we thought before the show started, we thought he was going to be the creepy old dude, but it turns out he's actually not.
He's pretty good. I think the producers work really hard to make him look bad.
Of course.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, you know, somewhat awkward, you know, yeah, a little bit. I don't think he doesn't quite know how to handle the fact that he does have this beautiful woman who's smart and articulate and funny and, you know, and everything. But, you know, it seems to work out well. So, I mean, he's obviously got something redeeming about him because she doesn't seem to genuinely care about him.
Now, do they take into the fact the I don't want to say mental state of the American citizen sponsoring? I don't want to go into IQ, but kind of like, you know, you talk to them, you know, they're gullible, they're
They're touched in the head a little bit.
Or they're going to fall for something. I mean, is there any kind of consideration for is the sponsor mentally able to sponsor someone?
That's a really fine line. I've dealt with that a few times. I want to protect the privacy of the people involved. Not that I could recall anything that would give away, but I do remember having a case in front of me where I was really concerned about the mental state of the petitioner. I was very concerned that the petitioner did not have the faculty to quite understand what was going on, and that he was going to get frauded, or he was being used by someone maybe perhaps a bit unscrupulous. That case caused me a bit of heartburn. So it does come up. But I guess the challenge is us visa officers, we're not trained psychologists. Who are we to really say that someone who meets the legal criteria to file a petition is not competent to make that decision? If we find obvious transactional fraud, or the beneficiary tells us at the window that she has no intention of ever seeing the guy, we could do something about it then. But it's actually, I'm gonna give props to Angela. That was probably, she said the last episode, she said probably the most sensible thing I've ever heard her say, which is that it's my responsibility if they're trying to scam me, not the government's.
Don't protect people who don't need protecting.
I don't need protecting. She had a point there, though.
You could, I mean, we can debate that for sure. There's a lot there, but that was the most sensible thing I've ever heard her say. Good for her. If you have serious questions about the mental state of a petitioner, that can be really challenging. That can be really challenging for a visa officer, because on the one hand, who are you to deprive, an American citizen of something he has a right to do versus, providing a measure of protection? It's tough.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, I mean, if both of those people were in the United States, there wouldn't be really any way to stop them from marrying. So you're there in a capacity to establish fraud to an extent, because you're trying to weed out unlawful immigration.
Right.
And somebody coming in fraudulently is obviously unlawful. Mm-hmm. But at what point are you the adjudicator of their moral decisions? That's
right. Yeah. And I think that it takes a little while to figure that out when you're doing visas you're not responsible for the decision, for the potentially bad decisions that somebody is making. You're there to fulfill a legally mandated role. Make sure they meet a certain legal threshold, but you're not the arbiter of their moral compass. That's it. That is exactly right. I like the way you said that. You're not there to police their decision making. You're not responsible for their ultimate decision. If they want to engage in that relationship, it's up to them. I mean, we as TV viewers, we judge. That's why we watch the show. That's right. But your job is, you're not out there being the marriage police, and that it comes vis-a-vis this marriage application, sort of, but you're not there to adjudicate the relationship, the marriage itself, sort of the decision of that. Well, yeah, that's right. One other thing I wanted to mention too, when while we're on the subject of capacity to petition somebody, is you think about the threshold it takes for a court to declare an adult mentally incapable of doing something, right? For a court to deprive a person of their liberty, that's very high threshold, and that requires a legal process, right? So, fair enough. Us visa officers are so far from that. We have to give a little bit of deference. Okay, so let's get back to Michael and Angela, though, and let's go back to their example. Mm-hmm. So Michael and Angela's file hits your desk, and then Michael, 10 minutes later, Michael's going to show up to your window. Talk me through what you would do, and then your independent thoughts about what may have happened. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to see probably, because usually the files are always reviewed ahead of time by local staff, and they're just there to make sure the papers are all signed and stuff like that. But sometimes they'll highlight things that they notice. So the first thing I'm going to see is that there is a large age gap between Michael and Angela. Angela being much older than Michael.
That
Michael,
falls into that fraud. Those categories.
So we've already got one red flag. We're then going to see. Well, the first red flag is the age gap. The second red flag is the fact that Angela is much older than Michael. In particular, Angela is 54 and Michael is in his 30s, if I've got that right. So, Michael's never been married. He doesn't have any children of his own. Angela is essentially at the end of her reproductive career.
She's got one egg.
She's got one more egg, right? So that's going to be a red flag. She's from I would say, I'm trying to find the right way to say it. She's not from Atlanta. Let's put it that way. She's not from what we would call an urban part of Georgia. So she comes from a really rural area. The types of, the economic, you might be thinking about, well, is there any economic opportunity for him there? You're going to wonder a bit about that. How's he going to fit in a place like that? I think that would be a hard transition for anybody. Not to cast aspersions on Hazelhurst, Georgia. I'm sure it is. It has its own myriad charms, but it would be a bit of a transition for Michael.
Okay, but wait. Okay, so let me piggyback on that though. So to play devil's advocate, you've got this guy who's going to go to this economically depressed sort of rural area with this older woman. Like, can't that also weigh in favor of showing it's a legitimate relationship? Like, why else would you go with this woman but for love? You're not going to like, oh, I'm going to get a rich Manhattanite, Well, I think the flip side of that is he really going to live in Hazelhurst, Georgia, or is he going to get on the first bus to New York or just stay in Atlanta? Because you think about it in terms of, okay, here's someone much older than him. It's unusual. I mean, I don't know the Nigerian culture especially well, but from in China where I was operating, it was very, very unusual to see a younger man go for an older woman. That's very, very atypical. I think that pattern, it tends to be, not everybody is Emmanuel Macron, right? I think he's the exception. So you're already kind of wondering about that. Then you're thinking, in addition to those kind of strikes against him, he's going to go to an economically depressed kind of rural area. How in the world is he going to, do anything there? It seems more likely that he would just, get out of the airport and make for a big city as quickly as he could. I think that's the way someone looking for fraud would evaluate it. That they're not genuine about going to live there. So you're trying to get inside their head about whether they would, they say, yeah, I'm going to go live in this trailer, this double wide with Angela and her 6 grandkids. Mm-hmm. But you don't really think that you have to sort of get inside their head and make a determination if they really are planning to do that or if they have no intent to do that. And once they hit stateside, they're taken off.
Yeah, you're basically trying to figure out, okay, this is the story that this guy is telling me. Is he lying? Because it seems a little implausible. Is he telling the truth? And am I acquiring enough evidence through this process to tell USCIS, hey, you guys made a mistake, and here's why you made a mistake. Here's the new information I found. Mm-hmm. And USCIS, they don't know everything about Nigerian culture. They don't know what's normal for a guy of Michael's age. There's just a lot of information they don't have access to, and so they kind of rely on the embassies and consulates to double check their work. And the other thing with Michael, and this kind of gets into an aspect of his interview. Obviously, we weren't there; cameras aren't allowed inside the embassy. But I was always struck when I was watching him on before the last season of Before the 90 Days. There always seemed to be a little bit of an ambivalence in his affect about Angela, but not about going to the U.S. Mm-hmm. And if you're a visa officer and you're talking to him and he seems kind of ambivalent, he seems kind of flat about talking about her, but maybe much more excited when talking about going to the U.S., you're going to start to question his motives. And, we don't know for sure. We don't know what happened at there. But if I was sitting there talking to him and I caught that dynamic a little bit, I'd really start to question his motivation. And I do kind of suspect that's what happened to him. Obviously, I'm armchair quarterbacking it, but I'm a little bit wondering if maybe he came off just a little bit detached when talking about Angela.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you think that I don't know if they brought it up in his interview, but wanting children, that's been a major focus of the storyline.
Yeah, it could have come up. It depends on whether the visa officer had the presence of mind to ask that question, or if they were focused on something else. It's a legitimate question to ask. I just don't know if they asked it. Obviously, if let's say a visa officer said, "Well, Angela is 54 years old. How do you really expect to have a child?" And he says, and if he gave the answer he gave on last season, where God will just figure it out for us. Maybe that's in some ways a touching testament of faith, but also, it could also say this guy's not really serious. Something he wants, he knows he can't have, and he's just trying to act the part.
Okay, because so I want to touch on this a little bit. You talked about some of the cultural norms that you would see, like you guys on the ground would have, access to and information about, in this particular culture, it's not normal for this kind of relationship or things like that. I think so. With Michael's case, they've made a point on the storyline to make it that having your own bloodline children is important for them culturally. That's why they were like, oh yeah, you can go sleep with any other woman just as long as it's your blood. So something like that seems like it might play into the authenticity of the relationship. If that is really a big deal for a Nigerian man to have this bloodline, then he can't legitimately do that with Angela. Then that tends to go, okay, well, yeah, he's just playing the part, like you said.
Exactly. And if a visa officer was sufficiently informed on cultural norms, that's going to raise another red flag, and they're going to act upon that. And once you start getting a critical mass of red flags, your mind starts going to, okay, I don't believe this guy. Let's steer it towards what we need to do to put this on the path to getting denied or getting revoked.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Michael got a letter that had handwriting on it. Yeah. That there was a subject of a little bit of controversy, but we took the position that it was a real genuine. It was probably like the visa officer's handwriting on it or something. It was determined that he was ineligible and that it would recommend denial. How does that, from an administrative perspective, how does that play into this system? It's not a visa denial yet at this point. He's determined ineligible. What does that mean? And then, yeah.
So let me see if I can walk through it with some precision. I didn't pause or anything, but I saw what he was holding up to the phone on that episode. That's a we call that a revocation letter. That's a standard form letter that all embassies and consulates have. I think you guys brought this up, that someone was saying that, well, it's not on official letterhead or it's not on official paper. That's not really a factor for something like this. I think you guys correctly pointed out that USCIS has their fraud proof paper that they send requests for evidence on. This is just a document that's typed up in Word or sometimes generated by the software that manages the visas themselves. And so it can just be done in Word or just printed on a regular piece of paper. But the language in there is very standard, what we call revocation language. So what happened is that Michael's visa was refused under a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act that technically puts a case on hold pending the receipt of some documentation or some administrative action. His visa was denied under that section of the law, and the letter explained that his file was going to be returned to USCIS with a recommendation from the embassy that the underlying petition be revoked. So the embassy will write a memo. They'll include additional evidence explaining to USCIS why, in the embassy's view, they made a mistake in granting that petition and why USCIS should amend their decision and revoke the petition. So he's been refused a visa under that section of the law, and his petition has been slated to be revoked, or I suppose you could say denied. We always say revoked. So
because
basically,
the petition, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that's from I guess described somewhat technically what happened. The letter is authentic. It was either the visa officer or a local staff member who wrote a note on their forum. I think, the letter will probably, I'm trying to remember exactly what it said, but it'll have information it'll tell them, to wait for, be contacted by USCIS. Maybe they gave an additional note or something for him, or it could have been his handwriting for all we know. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing he called Angela from his car, like right after he got out of the embassy compound.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my guess. But the letter is fine. It's not fake. And so when a decision like that is made, so this has come up too. I think you've gotten questions about it, and that's something I've seen. If the basis for revoking his petition had to do with the number of dependents Angela had, he would have gotten a different letter.
Okay.
A letter saying that they're going to revoke the petition means that the underlying basis for the petition, which is the relationship, the petition is there to say that by the government standards, this is a bona fide relationship. Well, if the visa officer has questions about the petition or wants to revoke the petition, the relationship is the thing that they don't believe is authentic. The issues regarding the number of dependents, sometimes an excess number of dependents can be a fraud indicator, because a visa officer could say, well, geez, Angela's got, one daughter, another daughter. They don't know that she's in jail, but she has a daughter in jail. She's got 6 grandkids she's taking care of and an elderly mother, and she's a hospice worker. Geez, she needs some money. Maybe there was a financial incentive for her to bring this guy over. Maybe she's getting to help deal with that. So that could be a basis for a recommendation of a revocation, but it's just one of several factors. Typically, it does not control. And if it was just the number of dependents and everything else was deemed to be fine, they would have refused his case on either under the section of law that allows a case to be put on hold, or under a different section of law that says that you cannot issue a visa to somebody who will become a public charge. That is someone who the government thinks will go to the U.S. and start collecting welfare checks.
Correct.
But that ineligibility can be very easily overcome by getting another bona fide co-sponsor.
Okay, that's a really good question, because a lot of people had this question that said, does Angela not make enough money, all of this stuff. My thought, and please correct me on this, was if her income wasn't sufficient, or like it wouldn't have gotten to the interview phase yet. Like they must have deemed her as being okay. She met either with or without a co-sponsor. I don't know if she has one, but she met that economic threshold, or Michael wouldn't even be at the interview, or no. Does that not?
He could have gotten to the interview if she had insufficient means. It's a little different with K-1s than it is with relationship categories, because it's a different form. But it's very common that you'll get a case where the document for the co-sponsor, either they did the math wrong or something like that. You look at it and you say, this isn't enough. Sometimes what'll happen is that you're required to submit your tax returns with these sponsorship forms, and USCIS will have had only maybe 2 years, but then you get the 3rd year and the averages don't work out anymore. It's very formulaic, but in that case, so even if he had gotten there and was found to not have the correct sponsorship information, they would just say, okay, you don't qualify now, get another co-sponsor, come back, and you're fine.
But that would have been a different form, a different kind of response to Michael.
It would not have mentioned the petition. It would have said, you've been refused under, some code or some different code, and please bring back, here are the documents you need to bring back. It would have been a very, very different letter.
Okay.
And that's interesting, though, because the way you're describing it is they can get all the way to the interview and then go, your sponsor doesn't make enough.
That's right.
Like, I think the assumption online from a lot of people is if they're getting to the interview point, then the sponsor is solid on the income bracket. And you're saying that they have to also submit tax returns. How far back to prove income?
3 years.
Interesting.
It was 3 years when I was doing it.
Okay.
Okay.
I am aware that the current administration has tightened up to a degree some of the public charge provisions, so maybe they're going back further. But when I was doing it, it was 3 years.
Wow. Okay.
So it could get all the way through the process, and you could look at it and go, this person doesn't meet the threshold. Here, go find new you need a co-sponsor. You need more money. You need somebody who has a little more stability.
Right. You would either say, your primary sponsor doesn't make enough, or you'd say this co-sponsor you provided is bad co-sponsor. That was a very common reason to refuse cases.
Now, is it cut and dry on the income? I know they have the income brackets per dependent, how much you need to make to be eligible to sponsor. Is there any deviation from that list, or is it prescribed? You have to just make this much if you have one dependent, this much if you have two dependents. Is there any discretion with that?
There's a table. So,
okay.
So if I get this wrong, your listeners are gonna let you know. But if I recall correctly, it's 125% of the poverty income guidelines. So we would say it's 125% of the PIG, because we call the poverty income guidelines the PIG.
Oh,
that's great.
Acronyms.
And so whatever our poverty guideline is, it just has to be 125% of that. And then there's probably a percentage increase per dependent based off that table.
We would have at our windows typically. This is probably a little too much detail. We'd have a piece of paper taped on one side of our window that just showed the PIG and the number of dependents. And so you just, you add up your dependents, you look at the income, you compare it to your table, and it's yes or no. Very formulaic, very cut and dry.
Oh, okay.
Nice. Okay.
Okay. And just quickly on that, if somebody isn't working, but they have like a shit ton of money in the bank, is that sufficient?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a formula for how assets can be counted. And if you won Powerball, right? And you're just sitting pretty. Yeah, you could potentially be fine.
Okay. What about if somebody is on like disability?
Oh, that'll raise some red flags. Social Security or SSI income cannot be counted, and I believe it. I'm a little fuzzy on the rules, but it actively counts against you. If your beneficiary is already receiving welfare benefits, they can't be a sponsor. You're going to have to get a co-sponsor. And that can also be a red flag for potential fraud.
Interesting. So if I was on benefits, which is entirely, foreseeable for me, right, because I have multiple sclerosis. So, theoretically I could be in a position and I would become ineligible to sponsor somebody. Say I got into a relationship with someone overseas, that would count against me.
Well, if your income met the guidelines, if you're a work for the government, right? Your income will probably be sufficient to qualify as a sponsor on your own. But if your sole source of income is Social Security, you got to think about it from the perspective of the public charge ineligibility, right? If you're receiving welfare and that's all you're getting, and you bring someone else, then they will also be receiving welfare, potentially more welfare. And the government is charged to prevent that from happening, which is why you have that sponsor requirement. Now, if you are on welfare and you get a sponsor, let's say your rich uncle is going to help you out, that could potentially be fine.
Okay. While we're on the topic of sponsorship, there's this, we hear on the show a lot, this 10-year requirement. I'm responsible for them for 10 years. And I know that that's often very misunderstood because I think they make it out and probably intentionally to this drama about, I have to support him for 10 years. And this term support, I think, is a misnomer because it's my understanding is it's not this, I have to take care of their day-to-day expenses even after we've divorced or whatever, our relationship is over. It's just if they go to try to get welfare or some kind of government assistance, you then have to pay that to the government. Can you clarify this 10-year support stuff?
I think your interpretation is correct. I will say that even for us, that was a mysterious requirement.
Okay, because that happens after you, so it's a different office, right?
For us, it's a paper exercise to make sure that they meet the requirements. But I think people were a little bit puzzled on what exactly that means and how enforceable is it really. And which is a complex question. I'm sure someone has tried to answer at some point.
Yeah, we've had some immigration attorneys that have addressed it. And I think that does fall outside of what your specific role is in approving and denying visas. But that's something and on the same vein, a lot of people were asking questions like, Colton Larissa, Colt pulled his affidavit of support, so how come she's still here? And she's got 3 domestic violence arrests. How come she hasn't been deported? Why is she still here? Yeah. People wanted to know. If you have any insight on that, it may not be directly related to your job or former job as a visa officer, but.
So that's really a USCIS or ICE question.
Okay.
But I could say just really generally, the rules, the procedures and the rules that will govern a removal process are lengthy. So it's not like he can pull her affidavit of support and she gets arrested and then ICE is knocking on her door the next day. As you know, in the government, there's always a whole series of procedures. And one of the other things too, and again, some of your listeners who are immigration attorneys will have a better insight into this, but once they step foot on U.S. soil, the level of protection that they're afforded increases dramatically than when they're at us overseas at an embassy or consulate. A lot of the legal protections that we are afforded also are afforded to non-citizens. Not as many as we get, but the thresholds that have to be met in order for the government to take action increase the minute their foot lands on U.S. soil.
Interesting. Now, does it make a difference if they're married yet or not? And I asked this in the case of, I think Sinjin was arrested for, I don't think he was actually charged, but for having weed on him.
Yeah,
did he have to? I'm wondering if we're guessing when they got married, but would that have been an issue if he was not married yet?
Well, he has to apply to adjust status. And again, your immigration attorney listeners will know exactly when they'll do a check on his background. But, if he was applying for a visa, we would look at his criminal record. And if he had been, the term in the law is, if he had been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude, which is then defined in regulation, he would be ineligible. So if he was arrested and not charged, that might not be an ineligibility, but then he's got the drug stuff and there's a whole nother section.
So they could be married and currently in the process of applying for the status change, and that could be a hiccup because of that.
It could potentially be. I'm not familiar with the rules on that.
Gotcha.
But it probably will come up because I would imagine that they have the means to do a background check. They have the means to query those records. Just on their own systems.
Okay, so let's get back to Michael and Angela before we move on to some other specific couples. Can you hypothesize? You've alluded to it and whatnot, but can you hypothesize as to what happened about why he was denied, and then maybe commentary on their next steps? They each had attorneys give them advice that were conflicting. Can you comment on those?
Yes. So with Michael, my suspicion is that he went in for his interview. The visa officer identified a number of red flags related to his case. Angela's 54. He's in his 30s. Angela is an older woman. He's a younger man. Angela is not able to have children. He presumably might want children. It might be presumed that that's something that he is important to him. Angela lives in a very rural part of Georgia. That doesn't seem like a place where someone like Michael could really thrive. He may have presented kind of unenthusiastically to the visa officer. That's my own personal suspicion, from having done it, is if, he gave the kind of answers that he did during the show about Angela versus his enthusiasm for going to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
I think he could be seen as potentially being a little bit insincere. And so I think that the weight of all those concerns convinced the visa officer that Michael and Angela did not have a bona fide relationship, and therefore the decision was made to send the petition back to USCIS with a revocation determination. Now, I want to preview a little bit the next episode. We saw in the preview that Angela is going to flip out to Michael about the engagement ceremony. That wouldn't have had made any difference to the visa officer's decision, because
she was saying that, you didn't tell them about this, and thinking that impacted it.
Well, because they know the engagement ceremony, and that's part of the cultural thing, right? That's not actually marriage. That's just a ceremony celebrating the engagement.
Exactly. And
which wouldn't be seen as a marriage.
No, and even if they had one.
But wouldn't it be a sign of a bona fide relationship to have an engagement ceremony? You're saying it would be a non-factor.
I think it would, because, if you're really in this to create, if let's say you're doing this for money, Angela's going to get a big check at the end of this. You could convince a bunch of people to put on some fancy clothes and pose for some pictures, for doing a ceremony. I would very, very frequently get those types of pictures and that type of evidence submitted to me. And it wasn't especially persuasive. It didn't really tell me a lot about their relationship. All it showed me is that a bunch of people came to a place and they took a picture together. Okay. And I never found that especially convincing. So I don't think Angela's correct to chastise Michael about that. I think it was this big pile of red flags. So the visa officer decides to send the petition back for revocation. Michael just couldn't overcome the number of red flags that he had stacked against him. Regarding next steps, so let's talk a little bit about the lawyers. Angela's lawyer recommends that they wait for the petition to come back and they try to appeal it. That's really bad advice, Angela. If you're listening, don't do that. Bad idea. So K1 petitions.
Disclaimer: we're not giving legal advice.
No, we're not lawyers, but we're your friends, Angela. We're trying to give you friendly advice. K1 petitions are different than petitions for other types of spousal categories in that they have a 6-month validity. So by the time that petition got to the embassy, it was probably about 3 months old. And by the time it gets back to USCIS, it's going to be about 6 or 7 months old. So by the time that piece of paper gets to a USCIS officer, it will already be expired. And they're just going to administratively deny it or revoke it because it's dead. So waiting for it to come back and trying to appeal it is a complete waste of time. The petition's going to die on the way back to the U.S. With apologies to Mr. Lou Esquire, I do not think that was the best advice in the world. Similarly, Michael's attorney suggested getting a K3 visa. In all my time doing visas, I think I did one K3. They aren't used anymore. They're an obsolete category of visa. What Angela should do, her best chance for success, is to go to Nigeria, marry Michael over there, and then apply for a spousal visa, what we would call a conditional spousal visa. It's a different set of paperwork. It'll probably add another 12 to 18 months. So if she goes for the conditional spouse route, that'll probably be 12 to 18 months of additional time between now and when she could get him over. But what you'll see from that is that she did a K1, it got denied, but even in spite of that, they got married anyway, and now they're doing a spousal visa. So it'll show continuity, which is better than her trying to do another K1. or to try to wait for an appeal. I really think that, or a K3. A K3 is just I was so surprised. I went back and read the K3 rules, and it didn't make sense to me. So that's her.
So
best.
if they get married in Nigeria, that adds a layer of authenticity to the relationship.
Yeah, it'll
And
show.
so look, we're really serious.
Exactly. We would call those. We would say it would be a K1 to CR1. CR1 means conditional relative first class. That's a spouse married under 2 years. But we would you would see that it was just a progression. And so I think that's going to tell the best story for Angela. And I know that she doesn't want to have the wedding over there, but all she has to do is go sign a piece of paper at the courthouse. She could still have a ceremony back in the U.S. Really, if you think about it.
Right. Well, I know that. You know that. The American people know that. But Angela doesn't know that.
Yeah.
She's stubborn. That's her role. She's got to be stubborn.
That's right. That's right. So that's my view on that. I think that neither of them were particularly well served by their legal counsel on the last episode. But if Angela wants to listen to my advice, that's what she should do.
No, I asked you this on Reddit, and you had a great response about why that probably was approved, even though they'd only seen each other for that 8 hours. Can you explain that? Because people are asking, how does Michael get denied? And you just explained that very well. But Annie get approved. Okay,
so with Annie, they technically met the criteria, right? Met once in the last 2 years with some additional records of contact. But in my opinion, a place like the Dominican Republic, probably Robert and Annie are not the worst case they've ever seen. They're close in age. Robert's a bit older, Annie's a bit younger, but they're still relatively close in age. It's obvious what Robert wants from her, and it's pretty obvious what Annie is going to get out of the relationship from him. And it just wasn't bad enough to be worth their attention. I think that probably the visa officers there are really jaded and cynical, and they didn't have enough evidence nothing came up from Annie that was enough for them to feel like they could send it back. So they just let it go. Mm. And it's, and you get to that point where you don't feel great about it. It's like we were talking about, judging people's decisions, right? You don't have enough to make a clear case for fraud, so you just got to let it go, move on. Otherwise, you're going to be at the window all day and creating a lot of headache for people. In my world, we call that insufficient evidence of a violation. So yeah. It sounds similar. Maybe it smells bad, but you can't prove it. So here's your visa. Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly right. Okay. Now this might have been before your this might have been before your time on the show, but John and Rachel. Ooh, I'm not familiar with those guys.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
What season was that?
Any insight? So they were on the first season of Before the 90 Days. So they were about a year and a half ago. Mm-hmm. And Rachel lives in New Mexico and John lives in the UK. And John has been denied a visa because he has allegedly because he has an extensive criminal record, because he used to beat the shit out of people and damage some eye. He has a really bad criminal history. Mm-hmm. I don't know how recent the most recent one is. Mm-hmm. What I've heard with them is that he would need a waiver to overcome that. Right. So do you offer any insight? Yeah. So if he has a criminal background for getting into fights and assaulting people, that would be considered a crime involving moral turpitude, and he would be refused. He would be deemed ineligible for a visa based on having been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude. There are waivers available through, I think you have to go through the Department of Justice to apply for those waivers, but it's at their discretion. And I'm not sure exactly what the criteria are to issue that, because we would just give him a letter, say, here's how you apply for a waiver. And he has to have competent counsel or be able to go through the waiver process himself. And, I don't know what the criteria are. I suppose there are cases where they don't issue the waiver, but sometimes there are cases they're going to look at it on a case by case basis. So that if he wants to come over, he has to get a waiver for his criminal background and eligibility, but that's why he was refused, because he's not eligible.
Okay. So I don't know if you watched the show while you were still doing your job. Mm-hmm. Do you think that if that person came across your desk and you saw the show, would that inform your decision? Is that allowed to inform your decision?
So when I was working, I was not aware of the show. It may have been before the show came on, but I think the show was airing. It was airing when I was doing the job. But in China, we didn't get access to TLC.
Gotcha.
So that's always a very limiting factor, right? What cable channels you can get access to when you're overseas. But ideally, the way the government structures it is you're supposed to have a fair shake with any visa officer. So I would think that if you knew the person in front of you was a celebrity or was on a reality show, you'd probably want to hand that case off to somebody who didn't know them. That way they get as impartial an evaluation as possible. Because, if I let's say I went back to the embassy and who's someone from the last season of Before the 90 Day could come up to the window. I'm going to go another season. But let's say Karini comes to the window, right?
Yeah.
I've seen her season. She's not going to get a really impartial evaluation from me because I'm prejudiced to a degree by TLC's fraud.
That's where I was getting is, TLC is portraying these couples in a certain way, and does that give them a disadvantage if the visa reviewer knew their story? So that's kind of where I was going with.
Yeah, I think it's probably up to the discretion of the visa officer whether they want to keep holding that case. But I think in general, how we would handle these things is if you knew who the person was, you probably shouldn't be doing the interview. So I'll give you here's a different example that's also somewhat germane. Let's say your friend comes for a visa interview.
There you go.
You're not allowed to interview your friends. That's considered to be big no-no. If your friend comes up for a
conflict of interest.
Yeah. If your friend comes up, you hand it off to another officer. You're not allowed to interview your friends. And I think that somebody who you followed on a TV show would fit into the same category. It was funny, though. Every now and then we'd get a famous actor who came in, and all the local staff would gather around the window and watch because they really wanted to see this famous person up close. But because it was a famous Chinese actor, most of us had no idea who they were. So
True.
We didn't.
Did you ever feel the pressure? Like you have to accept them, because if you deny them, everyone's going to be upset at you. Yeah,
well, especially if who's the fan of the actor you're interviewing is the one who orders your lunch every day.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, you really don't want to get on their bad side.
Now, how does I think I'm going to get skewered for this. David and Annie, and I know Before the 90 Days, I know the traditional marriage. Mm-hmm. Is that a conflict for a K-1 visa? Because it's not legally binding. It's not a document that's signed via the government of that country. But does that impact approval or disapproval of K-1 visas?
So I didn't see David and Annie's season. Did they do some sort of ceremony in Thailand?
Yeah,
I'm trying to reach back. I believe they did, and I know everyone knows. Before the 90 Days this past season, Ben and Akini also did a traditional marriage.
Yeah, well, I saw Ben. I saw his season. So let's in either of those cases, if there's no document from the government, no piece of paper that was issued by a government authority saying that they're legally married, doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. What you have to produce for a K-1 is you have to show an affidavit that you're legally eligible to marry. Oftentimes, you'll also be required to do a records check and produce something from your local government that says, yeah, there is no marriage registered for this person.
Gotcha.
So even if they did a ceremony, if it didn't lead to a piece of paper, they don't care.
Makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so another question that came up is somebody like Rebecca and Ziad. So Rebecca has sponsored somebody on a K-1 from Morocco before, and then he ditched her as soon as he got his residency. and now she's going to try to petition Ziad. Is there a limit on how many times you can petition for K1, and what impact does the previous K1 approval with her previous husband affect her ability to possibly get Ziad over? Will it affect it at all?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It can potentially. If you're seen as a serial petitioner, then at some point they're going to stop letting you bring people over, because they're going to start to be suspicious if you're just there, as a facilitator of human smuggling.
But what if she's just dumb and makes poor decisions about her love life, and she picks these wrong men over and over? Are you at that point stepping in to protect her in her love life decision making? Or
I think that it would the level of scrutiny she would be subject to would increase successively for each K1 she files. Sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you file for a guy who's not going to be all that for you. That happens. It's fine. But if it's the second time, or more troublingly, the third or fourth or fifth time, you're going to start to ask some harder questions at that point. So for Ziad, Rebecca should be okay. She's going to get asked about it for sure. But I don't see that as a barrier. I personally think Ziad's family is probably going to be a bigger barrier for him.
Right.
Well, I will say, Ziad, if you are listening, wear your Rebecca shirt to your interview. That's going to really go a long way.
Oh, wow. I guess it would, wouldn't it? It's interesting, the things that there seems like there's a lot of common sense involved, but like in your discretion, which I think is fascinating.
I just think it would be a good touch for him to wear that shirt. It'll make these officers' day, that's for sure.
I think we also had questions about Mike and
Natalie.
Oh, Natalie, yeah.
Like, I don't think we really have the story formed of what's going on or why things are taking a long time. But I guess what's your speculation as to what could be holding up her visa?
Yeah, so I have written about this in my Reddit threads. So when you are getting a visa approved, this is not going to be surprising, but the government's going to check to see whether you're a bad person. And the government does have a way to check to see if you have the identity of a person who is a bad person. And in order for a visa officer to approve your visa, they have to make sure that you are not even close to being a bad person. And if you seem to be, if they're running some checks on you and they can't quite resolve whether or not you could be a potentially bad guy, they're going to hold your case up and do some additional work to vet that out. In some countries, some parts of the world, it can be especially difficult, where they have naming conventions that can be a little tricky. China was one of them, because when you phoneticize a Chinese name, you don't have the character or the tones anymore. Mm-hmm. So like for someone whose last name is Wong could be any number of Wongs, but you still have to figure that out. Countries in the Middle East with Arabic naming conventions can be tricky. And then, forgive me if I get this wrong, patronymic naming conventions, which are common in Slavic countries, also sometimes cause problems. So it is my guess that Natalie's name was close enough to the name of a bad person that the government felt like it needed to put her case on hold to just to be sure.
Gotcha.
And, someone on Reddit speculated about this, that, and I don't know, it's a theory. Who knows if it's true? Natalie's ex-husband was a successful businessman, and to be a successful businessman in Ukraine probably means maybe having some suspicious ties with the Russian mafia or some similarly unsavory group. And maybe because she was his wife at some point, she got caught in the net.
That is definitely a theory.
It's a theory. That's what it was a theory. But anyway, my suspicion is she got caught in the net somehow, and they're just trying to resolve that before they can issue her. And I think I'm sympathetic to Well, I don't know. I mean, actually, I think it's probably a blessing in disguise for Michael, given the last episode. But I'm sympathetic to people who get caught up in it. It's really frustrating, and I totally sympathize with Michael. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. He went over to the embassy to try to get some answers, and he came out 30 minutes later looking really despondent. There was no chance he was going to get any useful information there. My guess is he went in there, he went to the American Citizen Services window, he asked about his case, and he was at an embassy that was polite enough that they didn't just shoo him out immediately. So either they looked it up there, they sent him over to the immigrant visa section, and they looked up the case and gave him a very generic answer. One thing to be clear about: nothing is classified. The visa officer wasn't looking at some classified information he couldn't tell Michael about. When they're running security checks on somebody, they're not allowed to disclose that to the applicant. So they get a really generic answer. It's almost like a master class in saying nothing while saying something.
And that could have sparked why he came back questioning, right? Like, did you do this? Did you do that? Because he probably got this generic list of what could possibly impact. Yeah. And so.
Yeah, he got this really vague.
Or the entire scene was set up by TLC and said, let's go to this office and set this up, even though they won't tell you any more than you already know.
Yeah, and every embassy is a little different. Some, like where I was, petitioners were never allowed inside. They used to do petitioner hour, but then they stopped doing it. Other embassies will do a petitioner hour. Some of them are a little bit friendlier. It really depends on how belligerent they are in that part of whatever part of the world. And so it depends. So there's like a culture of like what kind of people go for the locals in that country, and are they the kind of people who are going to stand at your window for an hour yelling at you? You don't want that. That's always bad news. So Michael was lucky that he got to speak to somebody. In my experience, that's not always guaranteed. But and the guy believes in aliens. I don't blame him. I'm not surprised that his mind went to like, what kind of crazy conspiracy is Natalie caught up in? It just seems natural for him. I do feel a little bad for Natalie. I think she probably got caught off guard with that, even though because he's stressing out about it so much. But that's probably
it's TLC fraud.
Yeah, that too.
Producer-driven storylines.
Yeah.
I don't have evidence to support that. That's just my suspicion.
The ever suspicious frauded.
Yeah. Anyway, that's my take on Michael and Natalie. I think she just got caught in the net.
A lot of people have asked about the cost of the visa, but I don't know that that's anything that you have any special insight on that they can't find other way. I mean, do you have any insight on that?
It's always going up. That's my insight.
Okay.
Yeah, the questions is how are the cast members affording this is usually the question, since it's so pricey.
Well, yeah, somebody like Robert.
Does TLC help? Do they give them money ever?
No. I know, and I'm saying that from my window of knowledge, but I feel like there might be special occasions where they help out if it fits the benefit of the storyline.
I suspect that they paid for Angela to fly to Nigeria this last time.
Yes, definitely, because she was able to pick up and just go, and that's an expensive flight.
That's at least $2,000, yeah. To
just book. So, unless she just got the TLC check that week, maybe.
Yeah. So Robert probably saved up. I mean, the visa itself is probably one of the less expensive parts. You had a spousal visa. You've got to file for the petition. That's expensive. You have to file for you have to pay for the visa itself. You have to pay for a medical exam to get your med form. Sometimes there are other forms as well that you have to do. It can really add up. So, I ballpark, maybe you should probably, if you're going to do it, maybe budget $1,000, $2,000 if you're not using a lawyer. If you're using a lawyer, it's going to get more expensive.
And then it's not even over once you get back over here, because then you have to apply for the change of status, which is like an extra $1,500 just to get the actual change of status. So
and then 2 years later to remove the conditions, and then
So
Right.
it is the always giving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This has been a question that's been brought up repeatedly is the fact that Angela's daughter is incarcerated. Mm-hmm. Would that have any impact on their process? My answer is I think no, because it's not her. So
Exactly.
the fact that it gives her more dependence goes to that monetary threshold that you were talking about. But just the fact that she's incarcerated doesn't affect their petition at all, right?
No, I don't think so. How would they even know? I can't even think of how, unless Michael mentioned it at the interview. How would a visa officer even know that that Angela has a incarcerated daughter?
Sure.
Yeah. So I don't think it would come up.
I'm glad you said that, because I believe that it's a non-factor. I just wanted a professional to say that.
because then that would mean that, everyone who has a relative of some degree in jail could be penalized for their relatives' bad choices. So
yeah, no, I'm just listing through all the documents you'd see in a file. There's really no way you'd ever know.
Okay, so Hanekawa, do you have anything else? Because I think I've gone through all these questions. I think he's hit on everything. So do you have anything else?
I don't. I run through all the Facebook questions and my own personal questions. So I'm good.
Okay, so I have one final question then for you. Mm-hmm. That we have for you is, what is the strangest story that you have from working in, or if you can't do a single top one, what are a couple of your strangest stories from your time as a visa officer?
There's a lot of strange stuff that happens as a visa officer. But one of my favorite stories is, the applicants will often bring a lot of stuff to show you, but I had one applicant who was extremely well prepared. She marched up to the visa window and stacked up a series of bound volumes in front of me. And then at the center of the window had like a plaque with a poem written on it that the petitioner had written. And it was actually, I think it wasn't a plaque, it was a hanging scroll of some kind, but it had like a poem on it. And so I asked her just to let me see one of the bound volumes. And so she had like 3 or 4 bound volumes of correspondence, emails, letters, and things that they had written. And so the volume that I got, I thumbed through for a while until I came upon a section that they were talking about their shared interest in gardening and discussing how they were going to try to each fertilize each other's gardens with their own urine.
With their own what?
With their own urine.
Oh.
They were going to exchange jars of urine to fertilize the other's garden with.
Okay.
If you're discussing that level of intimacy, I guess you got something real going on. So,
did you approve them?
I approved her. Yeah, I did ask her if I could keep the book though.
You're like, I need this. That just makes me think of Anna Marcel. Like, what kind of bee tips were they trading?
Oh my goodness, I'm not sure I want to know that.
Oh God. Do you have any final parting words for us, or any thoughts? Or as Jerry Springer would say, final thoughts?
My final thoughts. I'm really happy that people are interested in actually understanding the visa process. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it. So, if I can ever be helpful in helping to, identify where the fraud is, what's real and what's not real, I'm always happy to be a resource for you guys or anyone else who's interested. So, it's be inquisitive, ask questions, because the truth is out there.
The truth is out there. Well, great. So you can be found on Reddit. And yes. Do you want to share your username?
Just look,
or just look for the Ask a Visa Officer.
Yeah, look if you use Reddit, and shout out to 90 Day Fiance subreddit. Those guys are great. Look for my Ask Me Anything style threads. I usually will call them Ask a Visa Officer threads. Also, if any of your listeners are interested in asking a question or getting some clarification on the visa process, they can send me an email at askthevisaofficer. That's all one word, askthevisaofficer@gmail.com.
That's amazing. I love
Wow.
Yeah. And so depending on, if, I'm not quite sure what level of interest there'll be. So,
Be careful what you ask for.
it's just a few emails. I'll probably just respond directly. But if it's a high volume, maybe I can do something fun with that. But yeah, they're welcome. Your listeners are welcome to send me an email at that address, askthevisaofficer@gmail.com.
Great. And we will link that in the show notes for you guys so you can just hit that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time we've been talking for a long time. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for taking the time and informing us of this. I'm sure as the season progresses and as there are additional seasons, we will want your input for those. So I look forward to having you back.
Anytime. Always happy to do it.
Yes, definitely.
So moving on, let's do some shout outs, shall we?
Yes. Who do we have today?
We have Milica from Serbia reached out to me on Instagram. So I want to say hi to her. Hello, Milica. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She lives in Serbia. She was thanking me for putting the Frauded Night Lives up on YouTube because of her time difference. She doesn't get to catch them when they're live, so she's glad that she gets to see them. So on that note, actually, so hello, Milica. Thank you, and I'm glad that you enjoy them. All of my Frauded Night Lives, which is where we discuss Friday nights at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, or 10 p.m. now that Love After Lockup is on. 10 p.m. Eastern on Friday nights, we discuss the gossip of the week. Those all get uploaded to YouTube. And new this week, I've also added all the episodes of the Fraudcast, and every video that's up on YouTube has closed captioning for our hearing impaired fans.
That's awesome.
To help support that, if you can like and subscribe to the channel, that will help support my ability to continue to put all of those up there. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So I will take on the next one, and this one comes from Melody. She says, your show has really grown on me. I've become obsessed with the fraud, look forward to new episodes, and rush to get the toddler in bed early to have plenty of time to settle in for Frauded Night Lives. Life has been a little crappy that your show has been such a needed and appreciated distraction. Love Hetero Life Mate and Hanekawa too. Oh, I always like that.
Aww.
I'm with them. Like, I was not a person who was always searching for the fraud until it kind of touched personally, and now I am all in it. Your balls probably
deep in it.
Probably stupid obsessed. People are like, why does she care? I'm like, you don't understand.
I know, I get that a lot. Is why are you so obsessed with me? Like, digging into this. Why do I spend so much time digging into it? And I think it's just, I can't help it. I see this stuff that I know is fraud, that can't be real, that I just have to dive in and find out. And that's kind of how I got started, was I'm like, that can't be real. Right. And then started looking into it. And now this is, what I do on my non-work time. All right. So next we have Callum. She says, I love the podcast, not only for the inside scoops, but also because of the chemistry between Katrina and Hanekawa. Please keep up the great work. With that said, I was wondering whether Katrina might be willing to talk a little bit more on the podcast about her experiences with MS. My eldest brother was diagnosed about a year ago, and he's understandably struggling to adjust to life with MS. So when I started listening to the podcast, and I'm one of those who listens to the podcast but does not use Instagram, I was taken aback to learn that Katrina was not only living with MS, but also working as a lawyer, raising children, dealing with Hetero Life Mate. And on top of all that, exposing TLC fraud on a regular basis. So Katrina, how do you manage all that? Do you have any advice for my brother? I'd appreciate any insights you might be able to share, because I think my brother would, like me, find your story inspiring. Thanks again, and keep up the great work with the podcast. Now, that's a mouthful. And yes, I would be happy to share a lot of that. And I don't know that right now is the right forum for that. Perhaps I can do like a bonus episode talking about MS. I can do a bonus episode talking about sobriety. I know people were talking about that as well. or I can do like a video and upload it to YouTube. I'm certainly happy to talk about any of that. You don't use Instagram, but you can always reach out to me. You can email me. I can respond to your email too, and we can have a dialogue that way. But I would love to do like a mini episode, not TLC related, but like an extra where I talk about the MS or the sobriety, things like that, so that for those of you guys who are asking.
I think that's awesome, because even if it's separate podcasts, there's, of course, the people who just want to deal with the TLC frauded, but there's also people that tune in because they want to hear about your sobriety story or your MS and all that stuff. So I think even just a separate live or even a separate podcast episode, like little bonuses, would be awesome.
Yeah, I think that that might be a good way to approach it. That way people who are here just for the fraud don't have to, they can choose whether they want to listen to the MS or sobriety or whatever too. So I think that's probably what I'll do is I'll probably do a bonus episode on my MS and maybe a bonus episode on my sobriety. That was always that was a popular topic on the New Year's Eve live, is we talked a lot about that. And that was sort of the purpose of it is, let's have some, if you're struggling, and this is something that I say all the time, if you are struggling with any aspect of addiction, I am absolutely always here to talk to you. So I am Frauded by TLC. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Frauded by TLC. You can find the show at talkersoffraud.com. A note about the website, the store that's on there right now is going to be coming down in the next week or so. So last chance to get any of those items that are up there. We're going to reshuffle them, getting a new vendor. We're going to change things up with some new fun products that we have in the pipeline. So last chance to get what's up there now. And you can find us also on Facebook at The Fraudcasters is our Facebook group.
Yes, and our Facebook group is super easy to get into. You just have to answer 3 questions and you're in.
And there's no right answer. You just have to answer them.
Just let us know you're alive. And so you can find me at cactus_fruit_juice on Instagram. And something exciting that I'm doing, I'm actually teaming up with There Is No Store. That's at There Is No Store on Instagram. And we're actually going to do a giveaway. So I am going to do a 10K giveaway. So it's a little ambitious, but do want to team up with There Is No Store. She does really cute, let's say 90-day related items. So stickers, canvas bags. They all have sayings on them. I think the bag for Angela says or has her on it, the tote bag because she totes. But it's a lot of
some great, there's some great keychains and stickers and a lot of
magnets. She does and her lighters. Yes, and she has a Danielle hologram sticker that literally is everywhere. And so keep an eye out for that. If you go ahead and follow me, you can follow at There Is No Store, and we're going to have that giveaway information out there on the 8th of January. So very excited about that.
Well, and she's going to have to get 10K giveaway, right? You want 10K followers, right?
Yes. So it's going to be a little fun. So each 1,000 that I reach, there is going to be kind of a mini prize. And then once I hit 10K, there's going to be a grand prize. So it won't be just a lot of waiting because I know I have a little bit to go, but it's something fun to do in the meantime.
Well, let's help her get there, you guys. Make sure you go follow her on social media, on Instagram. And that's our show for today, you guys. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. We know your podcast listening time is limited. And as always, we thank you for listening and choosing to listen to us. I am Frauded by TLC, and I'm dumpster diving, so you don't have to.
You can find your Fraudcaster on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Frauded by TLC and on the web at talkersoffraud.com. This Fraudcast has been produced and edited by yours truly. Art by Sarah Dawdy. Music written, produced, and performed by Ooh Mommy. Segment producer at iHeart Reality TV Shows. Further assistance provided by many unnamed fraud consultants.